Okay, all right, so the next speaker is Theodora Bloom. She is the executive editor of the British Medical Journal. Previously, she served as the founding editor of Genome Biology. Theo, in her past, was closely involved in the birth of the commercial open access publisher, Biomed Central. Theo's talk today is entitled, Preparing to Handle Dynamic Scholarly Content. Are we ready?
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to Crossref for asking me to be here. I feel a little as though Jennifer just showed us Google Earth, and I'm going to talk to you about a little map of my neighborhood, sort of small-scale version. In terms of what I'll talk about, I'm talking as a journal editor, and at this point as a medical journal editor, although I'm not a medic. My key message is really that the idea that there's one monolithic article that we publish is sort of dead. There are changes that are happening before a paper is ever submitted to a journal, changes that happen after it's published. There's a specific proposal I'm going to talk to you about how we change how we handle corrections and retractions differently than we do now. And this sort of balancing act we have to strike between speed and reproducibility that seems to be a struggle that we all have. And I'll try and say a little bit about why any of this matters. I should declare my interest. So I work for the BMJ, which is wholly owned by the British Medical Association, the doctors' trade union in the UK. But it's a sort of mission-driven journal striving to improve healthcare and help doctors do a better job for their patients. So I'm fully employed by the BMJ. I have another conflict of interest or competing interest, whatever we call those, in that I chair the Literature Services Advisory Board for the EBI, which runs Europe PubMed Central. And in the recent past, I've been on the board of the Dryad Digital Repository. I was employed by PLOS, and in the more distant past by Biomed Central. And you'll see why those become relevant a little later on. So first to talk about some ancient history. The BMJ, like Nature, Science, The Lancet, it's been around quite a while and has transitioned in that time from being a sort of black and white news sheet to a slightly more full-colour printed journal, but also, of course, online. And it has a sort of proud history of medical findings that really sort of do matter to us, like finding out that Anopheles mosquitoes were linked to malaria, or that smoking is linked to lung cancer. And for all of this long history, the core process of a journal editor has been pretty much the same. An author submits something to a publisher, there is some peer review, the paper gets edited, somewhere gets accepted by the publisher, copy edited, typeset, we still call it typesetting even though nobody sets any type anymore, and publishing. And this really has existed from 1850 to today. And indeed, a couple of months ago at the Peer Review Congress in Chicago, Aileen Fife, who's a researcher in the history and philosophy of science, presented a study from the Royal Society, whose journal's been going for maybe 400 years, showing that really they kept a notebook that listed who peer-reviewed which paper. And you can still look at that for sort of hundreds of years back. And I have to say, because I'm very old, when I started work at a journal, that's pretty much how it was. I mean, we had index cards. We were way ahead of a notebook, but this was how you track peer review. Things have moved on a little in the digital age, and we have sort of more versions of things to think about now. So, particularly, we've got that core process, which, as I say, largely hasn't changed. But before you submit your paper to a publisher, maybe you've registered a protocol. Many fields now recognizing that will help define what the study was intended to do and then check that you did it. Presumably you'll have generated a data set that is in somehow related to your work, and you may even have posted a preprint of it before or at the same time as you submit to the publisher. And we all want those things to be tied well together, and sometimes publishers want them submitted to them, or at least information about where those have been submitted to go along with that publishing. And it's not just that you're tying them at the time of submission, you want them all tied up somehow to the published version of record that you end up with. And if you're like the BMJ or Faculty of 1,000, various other people who are represented here, then you may well be also posting the author's accepted version, the peer review reports, the submitted version. The entire history is there for people to see, and you want those things to be really tightly tied together. But I'm sure some people will say, do we need all these different versions? What are they for? In terms of the case for preprints, we're talking about really speeding things up, making it faster, but also getting away from the idea that 2 or 3 expert peer reviewers know everything there is to know about a paper, and instead letting the wisdom of the crowd feed in, get good feedback and modification to try and make better the article that's finally submitted. It of course gives a date stamp that gives the authors some sense of precedence and claim, and most preprints are freely available, although they're not always open in the sense that you can do what you like with them. You can at least read them and download them. When it comes to protocols, there's a particularly sort of strong case from clinical medicine where, you know, it's important that people know that a trial is being done and when and where and how, but also that ahead of finding any results, you define what it is you're looking for, because there's a long history of cherry picking, of finding a bit of data that might be useful in some way to promote a particular treatment or therapy. And it should help mean that all trials get published, because you know when they start and finish. Although, sadly, it's clear that they're not all published, basically, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And ultimately, this is because we want to know every time we pop a pill or take some other advice from our physician that this is based on good evidence. And unfortunately, mostly it isn't. And in particular, this notion of not actually publishing the outcome of clinical trials. A sadly recent study that says that, you know, something like 300,000 study participants in hundreds of trials that are still not published 5 years after completion of the trial. So we have a real problem with actually saying what's been done and why in terms of clinical trials. So all of that good stuff happening before the version of record, but what about after publication, and what kinds of things happen after an article's been published? Surely it's the version of record, it's going to stay there. But no. You can have everything from a comment that tells you that someone spotted something or disagrees, through to corrections, because actually the authors agree that there was a mistake made, or an editor's note, but the authors don't agree there was a mistake made, but the editors think there was. Expression of concern, where the editors are saying there's something seriously wrong. A partial retraction, some part of the paper can't be relied on. A complete retraction, but then replace it with something very similar. Or maybe just complete retraction. Nobody should be relying on this article at all. And of course, somewhere down the line, you may have a fully revised version of a paper from the time of publication. Is this the best we can do in the digital age, to say something's changed after a paper's published? And that's even without counting in the Twitter and Facebook and all the other places where people are, you know, announcing things about papers after they're published. So to try and deal with one small part of this complexity, with a group of former colleagues, including Jennifer, who you just heard from, Ginny Barber, who was chair of COPE at the time we started this, COPE being the Committee on Publication Ethics that you heard about, and also Elizabeth Moylan, who is on the COPE Council and is a former colleague from Biomed Central. We put together a proposal, initially posted as a preprint, then after some community review, now submitted to F1000, that we really think it's time to stop this complicated business of corrections, retractions, partial retractions, retractions and replacement. And to sort of put a framework on that, there's this range of things that can be wrong with a paper, ranging from simple error. You did something wrong, you misinterpreted what you saw, you analysed something wrong, you had an error in your Excel spreadsheet, whatever, all the way through to, outright fraud and invention and corruption and all those sorts of things. And somehow we represent that whole spread of activities with this range of sort of commenting and expressing concern and all of that. With retraction preserved for the most sort of egregious, in some people's minds, that sort of evil has been done, skull and crossbones, but actually also just the whole paper is unreliable. So, what's wrong with that nice system? I mean, it's very slow, and it's very inefficient, and it's very stigmatizing. So anyone who's ever had a retraction, it is not seen as a badge of pride to have had to retract a paper, and that people will always assume some wrong was done. It gives negative connotations to honest errors that may have been made. It takes a long time to get all the parties involved to agree on an outcome, and often journals can't do anything in the meantime. They're prevented by law or just by uncertainty, while protracted investigations go on at an institution or elsewhere to try and establish what's happened. And there's a lack of transparency for the reader, and some of these notes you'll see on the right are about telling you the complaints that people make. There was a blog post when I was chief editor of PLOS Biology complaining that 6 months and the journal's done nothing. I've got to tell you, 6 months is pretty swift if you can resolve some kind of dispute about how an article became problematic. But in the meantime, there's nothing public that anyone can see, and you're simply left with the paper still standing. There's an inconsistency of approach. Publishers come up with their own favourite ways to do things. As I said, we're constrained by lawyers oftentimes. And the cost to science of this sort of loss of trust that papers are out there that everyone knows have a problem, but you can't deal with. So what could we do instead? The proposal that the four of us initially put together is that we simply say something's changed or something needs to change, and we call that an amendment. That's a sort of neutral term. It can mean a minor thing, or, if you're an American, the Fifth Amendment's pretty important, can be a big thing. We were searching for some term not currently associated with the system. And we try to call out the fact that as publishers and editors, our role is about integrity of the literature. It is not about investigating wrongdoing and finding that stuff out. That belongs with the employers, the institutions, the hospitals, the drug companies, everyone else. What's central for us is that you quickly post a note saying, there's something wrong here, and here's what we think it is, without saying who did it and why, and accusations. We think all of this should be as transparent as possible. You must always preserve original versions and say what you've changed and why, but that people should come to the most recent version by default. And obviously, machines have to be able to tell as well as human beings what's happened, and that's where all the sort of metadata behind the scenes will come into play. And of course, this just really needs to bang home to everyone that the idea of a journal article sort of standing forever unless it's formally retracted just needs to be dead and gone. The one thing we think is worth preserving is some kind of indication of the scale of amendment you're talking about. Is this something really small like a typo that has no substantial effect on the article? Is it reasonably major, something significant has changed here, or is it complete, the whole article needs to be disregarded and start again? And how that would look, we think, is that an amendment notice would say who is issuing this, why, on what scale. The why may be very brief to begin with, it may get more complicated with time, and the narrative can be added to over time. And obviously that kind of backroom linkage that Crossref can help everyone do. And to try and work out how much time this might save, we worked through a stylized COPE case in which is a very common thing where there's some problem with a figure, a Western blot or whatever, and the publisher and the editor and the author can't all agree what to do, and it has to go back and forth to an institution to say what should replace this and have the authors got enough data to replace it, or should the paper be retracted, whatever. That takes around usually a year or two. But you could have posted something 3 months in saying, everyone acknowledges there's a problem around figure 2 and figure 3, we're looking into it. So there's a long period there where we could have had a notice. And then a real example that sprang into mind when I was saying that, the BMJ retracted a paper a couple of years ago that was published 25 years earlier and was clearly a fraudulent piece of work. However, every time anyone suggested posting a retraction, correction, or other comment, there was a legal threat. And it wasn't until, in this case, a Canadian broadcasting company ran a program saying this guy committed loads of fraud and, you know, really exposing everything. He sued them and lost. And at that point, all the journals could retract all the papers. But it's just crazy to wait. It's a real failure of our regulatory system that we waited 25 years to be able to do that. And again, I mean, that, dare I say, it wasn't a terribly important paper, but there are ones where it matters more. And this isn't about retraction or correction specifically, but there's a study, a case of a well-known study of an antidepressant that was said to be safe and effective, including in adolescents. And in fact, it turns out the company had data all along that showed that that was not the case. And until the data were made available and reanalyzed by others, in this case, an independent group, who said it was always clear that this should never have been prescribed. And in the meantime, people have died as a result. And to me, as a publisher, most of what I do doesn't matter that much. But it really matters if you get this stuff wrong. So, you know, we're trying to work out how we can implement this proposal, and part of that is doing what we're calling a feasibility study, where we will, in private, try and track how we would do an amendments process instead of the current best practice, and we'll see how much time would it save and what would the notices look like and how easy is it for us to implement. And one of the things in talking about a feasibility study that very rapidly became apparent, including actually also from comments on the preprint, was that we need something the equivalent of, certainly in the UK and the US, I think you have these sort of signs that say police aware, you know, don't worry, we know there's a problem here. Something that just says, we're not saying who caused this accident, okay? We're not apportioning blame right now, but we know there's a problem with this. Or in the same way with a product recall. Again, you don't work out how the melamine was added to baby milk before you tell people, stop feeding your children this baby milk. Okay, so somewhere we've got to come up with those kind of equivalents. And to be honest, it's not going to solve all of the complexity I told you about, but you know, it does get rid of a few of those dozens of boxes down the right-hand side of what kind of changes we have. And I really wanted to come back to, finally, to the question of speed versus reproducibility, because we have a real dilemma here. Speed matters a lot, both to individuals worrying about their career and promotion, but also to the advancements of science. Now, Nature published a paper saying that the median decision time for publishing actually hasn't changed since 1980, pretty much. But the median is misleading, as ever, because what has happened is you have some quite fast journals and others that are getting slower and slower. But I was really taken with this back-of-the-envelope calculation that's done in a video online by Steve Quake at Stanford as part of this ASAP Bio, can we make things happen much faster movement. He said, you know, suppose that roughly the time between publishing a new discovery and making the finding and publishing it is currently around 1.5 years. And that around the same time is needed between something being published and the next person building on that. So another 1.5 years. If you can get rid of the first one of those, you've basically doubled the speed of science. That's quite good. But actually, if you reckon that each paper doesn't just lead to one further finding, but to 2, you very rapidly can say, well, you can pretty much have a 5-fold increase in the rate of discovery in 10 years. And that seems worth worth trying for. I think if we can make science go that much faster. But you can make it go faster and you can get it right. And often those two are not really in sync. And people may be aware of this paper from PLOS Medicine more than 10 years ago now, why most published research findings are false. In essence, John Ioannidis argues pretty convincingly that we know the errors we know about mean that you should not rely on any one individual finding. But as a follow-up paper said, that's right, but actually a little replication really helps at that point. So by the time something's been replicated, you can have a bit more faith in it. And really, again, why that matters, a very detailed study by Chalmers and Glasgow working out the level of waste between, doing the wrong kind of study and not registering the protocol and not analysing the results and not publishing them and not sharing the data and all of the things that we've just been talking about. They reckon that roughly 85% of what's done is lost. The benefit is lost. And when you think about the billions of dollars invested in research, the idea of losing 85% of it, even before you say there were things that were done that were sort of pointless and why did anyone fund them, it's just sort of heartbreaking. And if we can get the focus back on doing research that matters, publishing it well, describing it well, making the data available to everyone, I think, we will have done something we can all be proud of. And that's really all I have to say. I'll finish with a cartoon from the wonderful Hilda Bastian. If you haven't seen them before, you should go and enjoy. Thank you. I don't know if anyone had any questions. It's a bizarre room. I can't even see some of the people. So.
Hi, Theo. So given that your proposal, your sort of the way you set it out, has been available for quite a few months on a bioarchive, what have you, and it's got a lot of feedback. I'm just curious about what you think, what have been the major sort of objections or positive aspects that, that have helped you then inform the idea?
Yeah. So I think I want to give all credit. That notion of a sort of police-aware sticker, that absolutely came up with people saying you can make it even faster if you will just do that kind of thing without even knowing what the problem is. So that definitely came out of the feedback. And I think there was a concern raised that I don't know how to address, which was that, does this make it all more expensive, more difficult for small publishers? I'm not sure it does. I mean, it's already the case that people have great difficulty following COPE guidelines. And does making it sort of slightly simpler make that harder for them? I don't know, but it is a new system. And I think the worst case would be if we had just had yet another. If we still had corrections, retractions, whatever, and then we add to that amendments, then I think that would be pointless. So it's really only going to be worth doing if we persuade ourselves and then others that it's worth doing fully. There's been some pretty vocal criticism that we're only doing this so that Crossref can get more DOIs registered and more pennies out of publishers. I don't buy that, but I'm just sharing it. And some, I think, willful misinterpretation that says that this is all because publishers don't care about fraud and misconduct. We absolutely do. It's just that it's not our job to investigate it. And it's not about us trying to, not have to report on it when it's happened. But it is saying that we can do a lot for the literature ahead of time. I don't know if, Jennifer, have I missed any other of the feedback? Yeah, those have been the main things. Thank you.
To what extent has BMJ put these recommendations in place?
So we are absolutely not publicly doing any of this currently. What we are starting to do is to say we will do this behind closed doors, and we will run in parallel with our current system and try and say for each thing that comes across our desks for the next 6 or 12 months, here's what current standard practice does, and here's what this would have done. How much does it change time? How difficult was it to come up with an amendment notice? all of those kind of things. How many times would we have had to consult the lawyers or not? Those kind of, try and monitor all the events and say whether or not it's any better.
Theo, I'm just thinking, I've been a huge fan of versioning on F1000 for several years, and going beyond real problems and legal issues, things that are coming from Pipier or other places like that, a Western blot issue. Isn't there a massive argument here for publishers to adopt versioning in a manner very similar to F1000 for the authors who are discovering themselves? It doesn't have to even go through the editor, who are discovering themselves, oh, shoot, this is not the sequence that we thought we shared, we need to correct the paper.
I'm absolutely with you. My experience, for example, at PLOS, when PLOS launched PLOS Currents, and even sort of looking at F1000, I don't see a lot of people voluntarily issuing new versions. Absolutely, on preprints, and there are sort of ways to interpret that. We issued a second issue of our preprint because we realized we hadn't put our ORCID IDs on it. Does that need to be a second edition, or is that just a minor amendment to a published article? I don't know. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's something where people are happy to do that when it's called a preprint, but they think that once it's published, it stands. And I think we can make that possibility available, but I'm not seeing a lot of people volunteering to take it up. But it will be interesting to see how that goes. Okay, thank you very much.